everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Along the Way podcast. And if you are watching on YouTube, my house might look a little bit empty. And that's because it is. But we'll talk about that. Today's episode is one that was requested by my followers on Instagram when I did a voting poll. So I'm really excited about it. And it is the season finale. It is the season finale for season 3 of the Along the Way podcast. So I am so glad that you are here, whether you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or whether you are watching on YouTube. Let's dive in to the last episode of season 3. As always, you guys know I cannot start an episode without shouting out my first ever sponsor, Inappropriate Trucker Hats. The episode before this, if you're new here, if you just like randomly stumbled upon this podcast and it happened to be the last episode of the season, there's 3 full seasons, and the last episode before this one is an in-person interview with Inappropriate Trucker Hats, with Becca, who is the founder, CEO, boss, biatch of Inappropriate Trucker Hats. And I actually went to the store in Prosper, Texas and filmed in the store. So that one, I actually really recommend doing it on YouTube, because we have the hats, we've got the backdrop, which is the big wall of Inappropriate Trucker Hats. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. But thank you to my sponsor, Inappropriate Trucker Hats. Becca has always gone above and beyond for me. And I can't thank her enough that every time I've ever reached out to her, she's just been like, absolutely, let's do that. So I cannot thank her enough. And as always, there is a discount code in the description of this episode. It's 25% off your order. You guys, this episode is going to come out right before the holidays. So I know your brain is already thinking about stocking stuffers. It's thinking about gifts for the people that are impossible to buy for. You guys, Inappropriate Trucker Hats, whether it's a gag gift or an inside joke, it's the best. It's the best. One of my best moments was when I got everybody in a wedding party an Inappropriate Trucker hat that was perfect for them, for their personality. It was the best. It was so fun. So you guys, if you're still scrambling for holiday gifts, take advantage of that 25% off. Go to inappropriatetruckerhats.com, which is in the description of this episode, to their website, and buy them all, because they're hilarious, they're awesome. But let's dive right into this episode. Okay, so like I said, this episode was one that was voted on by my followers on Instagram. So I essentially told them, I was like, I got a list of podcast topics. I'm only gonna do 1 or 2 more episodes for the season. Which one do you wanna see the most? And this one got the most votes. I wouldn't say by a ton, but it definitely was the winner for sure. The topic of the episode is raising kids in a shitty world. And I know some of y'all are like, oh, she said a bad word. Listen, there's no other way to say it. How do we raise kids, good kids, in a shitty world? And this is an interesting topic for me, because I've thought about it a lot myself as a parent, but also I've had, like, from an anthropological standpoint, for those of you guys who don't know, I'm an anthropologist by education. From an anthropological standpoint, I really think that we're making too big of a deal out of it. I don't want you to think that I'm undermining the severity of the world that we live in, but I also think that sometimes we get a little bit too egocentric and we think our world is somehow more devastating than the worlds before it. And that's my thought on that. But here's the bottom line, and this is the premise of what I want to talk to you guys about today. When it comes to raising kids in a shitty world, you literally just do your best to raise kids that won't contribute to it, in the sense that they won't contribute to the problem. You raise children, you do your best to give your children the ability, the education, the resources, as best you can, to be decent human beings who contribute to society in a way that they find meaningful and that benefits others as well as themselves. And you raise kids who can survive. And take that to mean what you want it to mean, but that's the bottom line. And I think I've always kind of felt that way. Well, not always, but I've felt that way even from before having children, because I had a conversation. I want to make sure that I do justice to the conversation. I was in college and I was having a conversation with a man who's a family friend of ours, and I believe they have 7 children. And at that point, even in college, I was feeling overwhelmed by the state of the world. And again, take that to mean what you want it to mean. We're all overwhelmed by different things. Whether you're overwhelmed by inflation, whether you're overwhelmed by politics, whether you're overwhelmed by natural disasters, whether you're overwhelmed by international issues, like we're all kind of in the same boat when it comes to that. Okay, but even in college, at that point, I was quite a ways away from having children. I guess in the grand scheme of things, I wasn't. But at the time, to me, it felt like I was a long ways away from having children. And I had this conversation with this man who, like I said, he had 7 children. At that point, I think the oldest was probably late in high school. So the majority of his children were grown. Some were married. I don't think they'd had any grandchildren yet. But I was interviewing him for my thesis. I was writing my honors thesis and I was interviewing him. And this question had nothing to do with the thesis. But like I said, I was feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the world, even in college. And I remembered asking him, how do you feel about, raising children in a world like this? How did you reconcile, the world feels like it's falling apart on a day-to-day basis, and you brought 7 children into that world. Like, how do you reconcile that in your mind? And he looked at me and he said, well, that's never ever been an issue for me when I think about it, because I just always knew that I was going to be raising the children that are part of the solution. And that stuck with me. I mean, that has stuck with me for years. And the solution, quote unquote, that could mean a lot of different things, but it was just his solidarity on the fact that, well, the world might be falling to pieces, but I'm going to raise children that are part of the solution, not part of the problem. So when it comes to us being parents and raising children in a shitty world, I think that has to be what we focus on. That has to be what we keep our eyes on, because if we're so focused on what's wrong in the world, we're not sowing into our children what's right in the world. Because the world is a crazy place, right? There's crazy things happening every single day, but there's also good things. There's also good things in the world around us. So are we putting those things into our children, or are we putting the negative onto our children? Like, what are we instilling in them? I ask myself that. I kind of frame that question back to myself frequently, where I ask myself, am I raising children who are part of the solution, or am I raising children who are part of the problem? And that's a hard question to ask yourself, because there are some days where I feel like I'm not doing the greatest job at it. Parents have to take accountability for their parenting. Listen, that could be an entirely different episode, and I have several episodes that, tow around that issue, where parents need to hold themselves accountable for their children. When your children are grown, when your children are teenagers, they're going to make decisions that are their own. But when your children are little, you have to hold yourself accountable for your own children. So I just always, I circle back to that conversation that I had with that man who had raised good children. They were good people. They're good people. To this day, they are good, solid, upstanding, salt of the earth people. And I just circle back to that, to where they could have gotten sucked into that overwhelmed feeling of the world being a dangerous and wrong and upsetting place. But instead, he chose to focus on the fact that he wanted to raise children that were part of the solution, not part of the problem. And that has always stuck with me. The other thing that I think about, and this is kind of what I was saying at the beginning, but the other thing that I think about when, we circle around this question of like, how do we raise children in a shitty world? Okay, well, the fact is that the world's been shitty for a long time. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, like I don't want to burst anybody's bubble, but the world has not been a super warm and fuzzy rainbows and butterflies place ever. Like there's never been a time where it's been easy to raise children in the world that we're living in. I mean, yes, a lot of us were raising children through the pandemic. That was uncharted territory. That regardless of how you view that situation, that was uncharted territory, okay? But we get so caught up as adults because it's us as adults. It's not our kids. Our kids should not be concerned with these things at the level that we're concerned with them. I think we all need to agree on that. Like if you are overwhelming your children with the weight of the world, you're not doing your job because they're children. They can't, their frontal lobe is nowhere near being formed. They cannot process things the way that you can process things. Can you teach your children to understand things like politics? Can you teach your children to understand things like the impact of government? And that's, I'm just drawing from that because that's the most relevant topic right now. Can you teach your children about those things? Yes, but you cannot put the weight of it on them. But the thing that fascinates me is we are so convinced that our world is the worst that it's ever been. And I don't subscribe to that channel. Like, I just can't get on board with that. Sure, there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of spiritual implications for the world that we live in. There's a lot of things that are not great. Trust me. But I am just not willing to go down that road where I'm going to pretend like my life is worse than previous parents' lives. Can you imagine, like, let's just put it in perspective. Can you imagine raising children during the Great Depression? Can you imagine raising children through any of the world wars if you were in a war zone? Can you imagine raising children during the Black Plague? Like, can you imagine raising children through the Roman Empire when Christians were persecuted and you would die for your faith? Can you imagine raising children through those times? No, I can't. I have no context for being able to imagine what it would be like to raise children in that world. So again, I think it all boils down to, am I strong enough? Am I willing enough to go above and beyond to raise children that can not only withstand the world that we live in, but grow up to be contributing positive members of the world that we live in? Because there's good people. There are good people in this world. Even if they don't necessarily agree with you on all things, there are good people in this world. There were good people during the Great Depression. There were good people during the World Wars. There were good people during all of those time frames and traumatic catastrophes. There are good people. So are you raising good people? Are you raising good people, or are you allowing yourself to get sucked into the culture? Are you allowing yourself to get sucked into the fear? Are you allowing yourself to get sucked into this notion that the world that we live in cannot be overcome? Because I just think that's a lie. That's a lie. If you allow yourself to think that our situation is so dire that we can't possibly raise good children despite everything that's going on around us, that's just us being weak-hearted. And I refuse to be weak-hearted. For the sake of my children, I refuse to be weak-hearted. And you can consider yourself a gentle parent. You can consider yourself an authoritative parent. You can consider yourself to be whatever kind of parent you want. All it boils down to is, are you raising children who are resilient and capable and able to leave a positive impact on the world around them? Those are the skills. Teach them whatever other skills you want to teach them. Whatever else you feel is important, whether that's balancing a checkbook or being able to start a fire with no matches. Okay, whatever you want to teach them, that's your prerogative. But the bottom line is are you raising them to be resilient and capable and positively contributing members to the world around them? That should be the goal. That should be the goal. If we fixate on the negative, we then internalize it. If we fixate on the negative things that are happening in the world around us, if we make it so much about poor us, woe is me, how could I possibly raise children in this world? And listen, I hear that argument all the time from people who don't have children. I just don't want to bring children into this world. This world is so messed up. I just don't want to bring children into this world. I just don't want to put that burden on them. Listen, if you're a diehard when it comes to that belief, I'm not going to argue with you about it, but I will present the option to you that says the world's always been this way. It just looks a little bit different. The world has always been dangerous. The world has always been unagreeable. The world has always been unfriendly in a lot of different ways. And yet people have been bringing children into this world for thousands and thousands of generations. So what does that mean for you? You're saying that you're so weak that you're not capable of doing it. That might have pushed some buttons, but I'm willing to say it. If you think to yourself you couldn't possibly raise good children during hard times, you are essentially saying that you're too weak to do it. Because people have been raising children during hard times for a long, long time. Some families have harder times than others. Some generations have harder times than others. But the bottom line is the world has never been a friendly place to raise children. The world has never been a friendly place in general. So we can fixate on what's wrong with the world, or we can fixate on raising children that are part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Again, if you are dead set on not having children, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to say that you need to have children. I'm not saying that it's your moral obligation to have children. That's not the point. All I'm saying is that there's never a good time to bring children into a broken world. There's never a good time to bring children into a broken world, and yet people have been doing it for thousands of generations. And guess what? For thousands of generations, good people have been the result of that. Through every generation, through every hardship, through every scary catastrophe that has fallen on this world, generation to generation to generation, there have always been good people who've come from that. There have always been people who have risen above. There have always been people who have survived and thrived, despite the fact that the world is not necessarily a nice place. So if we are going to fixate on how horrible the world is and how much of an impact that's going to have on our children, I would argue that we're not being strong enough to shield our children from it and raise them up despite it. We have to be strong enough to shield our children, but also make them resilient at the same time. Shielding our children does not mean that we don't allow them to experience hardship. We don't allow them to come to terms with the reality around them. Children need to experience those things. We cannot protect them from everything, but we can also shield them in a way that allows them to grow into who they're meant to be and shape them into who they're supposed to be without putting the weight of that world on them. We don't have to give in to the negativity, whether you want to believe that it's spiritual or earthly, whatever you want to think. We don't have to give in to that. We don't have to succumb to that. We can shield our children from it while simultaneously raising them to be part of the solution, so that when they're grown-ups, they're not part of that culture. They're part of a counterculture. And that happens in every generation. Some of you, think about your own parents, you guys. Some of you are going to think about your own parents and you're going to think, yeah, they were part of the culture. And some of you are going to think about your parents and go, no, my parents were part of the counterculture. Okay? That is a direct impact of how they were raised in many cases. whether they had good parents or subpar parents, the way that we're raised in this world that is unfriendly and uninhabitable in many ways when it comes to peace and cohesiveness and kumbaya, the way that we're raised impacts our ability to move out into that world and positively impact that world for ourselves, for those around us, for future generations. If we fixate on the negative, we are only allowing ourselves to be weakened by the thought that we're not capable of raising children in a shitty world. You are capable of raising children in a shitty world because generations upon generations upon generations before you have been raising children in a shitty world. You have to be strong enough to raise children that are part of the solution, not part of the problem. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the Along the Way podcast, the final episode of season 3. By the time this episode is posted, our family will be in a different house. We will be in a different place. We are going back to the ranching industry after a year hiatus, after 2 incredibly horrible experiences. We took a break. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to do, where we wanted to go in life. We had to ask ourselves some really hard questions. And we've been in kind of a content limbo for the past year and a half. And we are finally making that decision to go back to the agriculture industry. So by the time this is posted, the reason that my walls are bare in this final recording is because I'm packing. We're in the thick of it right now. By the time this gets posted, fingers crossed, I will be fully settled and fully unpacked in a new place. I really, really hope that's the case because there's quite a few weeks between me recording this and you seeing it live. But that being said, thank you so much for tuning in to season 3. Season 4, we will be back, and I cannot wait to talk to you guys then. And as always, thank you to my sponsor, Inappropriate Trucker Hats. You guys use the discount code, get some Christmas gifts, stock up on all the hilarious hats that you can, and don't forget that you can make a custom hat. You can make a custom hat with whatever picture, saying, whatever you want, okay? But there's thousands of designs that are pre-made and so funny. They go from just funny to inappropriate. They're not all inappropriate, don't worry, but definitely take advantage of that and support an amazing small business this holiday season. If you are listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel, leave a 5-star review, and even better, share this, tag me in it, and download this. If you download this to your phone, it helps the algorithm so much, and I would so much appreciate it. And if you're gonna share this on social media, you can find my handles in the description of the episode so I can see what you're sharing and what you're saying. And if you're watching this on YouTube, thank you for watching the first ever season that I have done visuals with. I'm going to come back next season even better on these visuals. I'm gonna do so much research. I'm gonna do the investments that are necessary to make this production of the visual so much better. But thank you so much for fumbling through it with me. I really, really appreciate it. It's been fun. I'm glad I added this aspect, and I can't wait to see you guys back for season 4. As always, you guys, don't forget, we're all learning these things along the way, and you're doing a great job.